45 seconds. That was all the time Wesley Carter had before three men would drag the woman into the black SUV and disappear into the November night. His German shepherd, Sergeant, had already seen what Wesley's tired eyes had missed: the glint of a knife, the practiced movements of men who had done this before, the way they positioned themselves to block any escape. The dog's muscles coiled, ready to spring, while Wesley's mind still wrestled with a familiar fear. What would people see when a homeless black man ran toward a wealthy white woman in a dark parking lot? Would they see a hero or another threat? But Sergeant didn't care about optics or assumptions. The dog had already made the decision. Wesley was still calculating, already started moving while his owner's hand hesitated on the dog's collar. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Wesley Carter had been invisible for 3 years. Not literally, of course, but in the way society stops seeing people once they lose their address, their clean clothes, their place in the acceptable order of things. He slept in the alley behind St. Augustine's Church, where Father Miguel Santos turned a blind eye to the makeshift shelter Wesley had constructed from pallets and weathered tarps. The priest was one of the few who still looked Wesley in the eye, who still said his name like it meant something. Most people looked past him now, or worse, looked at him with that mixture of pity and suspicion that made Wesley want to disappear entirely. He was 43 years old, a former Special Forces operator who had served 2 tours in places he couldn't talk about, doing things that still visited him in dreams. He had come home expecting nothing, but he hadn't expected this the systematic way: doors closed, the creative excuses, the polite rejections that always seemed to come with a glance at his skin before they even looked at his resume. 3 months ago, Wesley had walked into Morrison's Hardware on Palmer Street, his military discharge papers and security certifications in a folder he'd kept pristine despite everything else falling apart. The manager, a red-faced man named Chuck, had actually laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly, but the kind that said Wesley should have known better than to try. "Look, friend," Chuck had said, not quite meeting Wesley's eyes. "I'm sure you're qualified and all, but we need someone who fits the culture here. Someone our customers will be comfortable with." Wesley had understood perfectly. His Bronze Star didn't matter. His expert marksmanship scores didn't matter. His spotless record didn't matter. What mattered was that Chuck's customers might not feel comfortable being helped by a black man, especially one who looked like he'd been sleeping rough. Wesley had folded his papers back into the folder, thanked Chuck for his time, and walked out into the rain. Sergeant had been waiting outside, and the dog had pressed against Wesley's leg, sensing the defeat without needing words. But Sergeant had given him something beyond companionship. The German shepherd had come from the same rescue shelter where they placed military working dogs after their service ended. Sergeant had been 3 years old, discharged after developing what the handlers called aggressive protective behavior, which really meant the dog had bitten an officer who'd been beating a detained civilian. They were going to put Sergeant down until Wesley had shown up. Another damaged soldier looking at another damaged soldier. The connection had been immediate. Sergeant didn't care that Wesley was homeless. The dog didn't care about the color of Wesley's skin or the smell of the streets that clung to his clothes. Sergeant cared that Wesley understood him, that Wesley moved with the same careful precision, that Wesley's hands were gentle even when the world had been rough. They had trained together in the empty lots behind the industrial district, Wesley teaching the dog modified tactical commands, Sergeant teaching Wesley that trust was still possible. The dog had saved Wesley's life twice already, once pulling him away from a collapsing wall during a storm, once positioning himself between Wesley and 3 men who'd thought a homeless vet would be an easy target. They had been wrong. Tonight, Wesley had been making his usual rounds, checking the dumpsters behind the restaurants on 5th Avenue before they locked up for the night. He wasn't proud of it, but Sergeant needed to eat, and pride was a luxury. Wesley had learned to pack away with his medals. That was when he'd seen her. Lillian Foster. He didn't know her name then, but he'd seen her before, dozens of times over the past few months. She came to the Foster Foundation office 3 blocks from the church, always arriving early in the morning with coffee and determination in her stride. Wesley had noticed her the way he noticed everything, now cataloging details, assessing threats, staying aware. She drove a silver Mercedes, wore expensive but understated clothing, and always stopped to put money in the cup of whoever was panhandling near her building. Not the dismissive dollar bill drop that some people did, but actual conversation, actual eye contact. Sergeant had noticed her too, and that was what puzzled Wesley. The dog never liked strangers, never approached anyone except Father Miguel. But with this woman, Sargent would sit and watch with an intensity that wasn't quite suspicion, more like recognition. It made no sense. This evening, Wesley had been about to head back to his alley when he'd heard her voice from the parking garage, adjacent to the foundation office. She'd been on her phone, and even from a distance, Wesley could hear the tremor of fear. "I'm telling you, someone's been following me," she'd said. "No, I'm not paranoid. I've seen the same car 3 times this week." Wesley should have walked away. He should have minded his own business. Getting involved in the problems of wealthy white women was a good way for a man who looked like him to end up in handcuffs, or worse. But something in her voice had triggered his training, and before he'd consciously decided to do anything, he'd been moving closer, Sargent at his heel. They'd taken up position behind a concrete pillar with a clear sightline to her car. That was when the 3 men had appeared. They'd moved with purpose, spreading out to cut off escape routes. One had a knife. Another had cable ties visible in his jacket pocket, and the third had been speaking into a radio, coordinating. Wesley had recognized tactical movement when he saw it. These weren't random muggers. This was an operation. And standing at the edge of the shadows, watching everything with cold calculation, had been a 4th man. Older, wearing an expensive coat, his face twisted with something that looked like satisfaction. Wesley's blood had gone cold. This woman wasn't just being robbed, she was being taken, and he'd had 45 seconds to decide whether her life was worth the risk to his own. The alley behind St. Augustine's Church smelled like wet cardboard and disappointment, but it was home. Wesley had constructed his shelter with the same precision he'd once used to build forward operating bases in hostile territory. The blue tarp was anchored at angles that shed rain efficiently. The pallets created an elevated platform that kept him off the cold concrete. His belongings, a military duffel bag, 2 changes of clothes, a first aid kit, and Sargent's food bowl were organized with military exactness. Every morning at 5, Wesley would wake, fold his sleeping bag, and disappear before the early church staff arrived. Father Miguel knew he was there, but the others didn't need to. By 6, he'd be at the public library when it opened, using the bathroom to wash up as best he could, shaving with a disposable razor, trying to maintain some dignity. The librarians had stopped asking if he needed help finding books. They knew his routine now. He'd spend 2 hours searching job listings online, applying to positions he was overqualified for, receiving automated rejections that didn't even pretend a human had read his application. Then he'd walk miles and miles through the city, Sargent beside him, both of them burning energy they couldn't afford to waste but couldn't afford to keep either. The walking kept him sharp, kept his mind from dwelling too long in the dark places where his thoughts turned dangerous. It also kept him visible to the business owners who might call the cops if they thought a homeless man was loitering with intent. The survival skills that had kept Wesley alive in combat zones now kept him alive on American streets. But the enemy here was different. You couldn't shoot poverty. You couldn't outflank bureaucracy. You couldn't call in air support when the system itself was designed to grind you down. Wesley knew how to purify water, start fires without matches, and navigate by the stars. He knew edible plants and how to set snares for small game. But none of that helped when you needed an address to get a job, and a job to get an address. The catch-22 was perfect and suffocating. He'd tried the VA, of course. Spent 6 hours in a waiting room only to be told his discharge papers were filed incorrectly, and he'd need to come back with additional documentation from a unit that had been disbanded 8 years ago. He'd tried the homeless shelters, but they were full of people just as desperate and sometimes more dangerous than the streets. Sargent wasn't allowed in most of them anyway, and Wesley would sleep in a snowbank before he'd abandon the dog who'd never abandoned him, so he developed routines. He knew which restaurants threw out food at what times. He knew which gas stations would let him use the bathroom without buying anything. He knew which cops were decent human beings, and which ones would hassle him just because they could. He knew that being a black man without a home meant being suspect by default, guilty until proven innocent if he was lucky enough to get the chance to prove anything at all. But Sargent had changed the mathematics of survival. The German Shepherd was more than a companion. He was Wesley's early warning system, his backup, his reason to keep going when the weight of it all felt crushing. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense danger before it materialized. 3 weeks ago, they'd been sleeping in their usual spot, when Sargent had suddenly stood, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Wesley had trusted that instinct instantly, grabbing his bag and moving. 30 seconds later, the brick wall they'd been sleeping against had partially collapsed, weakened by water damage and finally giving way. The rubble had buried their sleeping spot. If Sargent hadn't sensed something, a vibration, a sound beyond human hearing, something, Wesley would have been crushed. Then there was the night with the 3 men. They'd been young, drunk, looking for entertainment at someone else's expense. They'd cornered Wesley in an alley, making jokes about cleaning up the neighborhood and teaching him to stay in his part of town. Wesley had fought in hand-to-hand combat against trained soldiers. These were children playing at violence. But he couldn't fight back. If he hurt them, he'd go to jail. If he defended himself, he'd become the aggressor in the eyes of any cop who showed up. So he'd done nothing, prepared to take the beating, when Sargent had appeared between him and the attackers. The dog hadn't bitten anyone, hadn't even barked, just stood there, 80 pounds of controlled violence, lips pulled back from teeth that could crush bone, eyes locked on the ringleader. The men had sobered up fast. They'd backed away slowly, then run. Wesley had buried his face in Sargent's fur and wept. Lillian Foster existed in a different world, one that only occasionally intersected with Wesley's. Her foundation office was a gleaming building of glass and steel, the kind of place where the lobby security guard would ask Wesley to leave before he even got through the door. But from the outside, through those floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see people moving with purpose through carpeted hallways, carrying coffee in real mugs instead of styrofoam, sitting in ergonomic chairs at clean desks. Lillian seemed to be the center of it all. Even from a distance, Wesley could see people gravitating toward her, seeking her approval, her direction. She was in her early 50s, he guessed, with silver threading through her dark hair that she made no effort to hide. She dressed in sharp business suits but always wore running shoes for her walk from the parking garage, carrying her heels in a bag that probably cost more than Wesley had made in his last month of military pay. What struck him most was her awareness. She noticed things. She'd see the elderly man struggling with the heavy door and hold it open. She'd spot trash on the sidewalk and pick it up. She'd stop and actually talk to Marcus, the vet who panhandled outside her building, asking about his day like she genuinely cared about the answer. Wesley had watched her once give Marcus her own lunch when he'd mentioned being hungry, then go back inside to order something else for herself. These weren't performances. She did these things when she thought no one was watching. Nora Patterson was usually watching, though. The older woman lived in one of the renovated brownstones across from the foundation office. She was in her 70s, retired from nursing, and seemed to spend her days sitting on her stoop, observing the neighborhood like a benevolent sentinel. She'd brought Wesley coffee once, emerging from her building with a thermos and 2 cups, sitting down on the curb beside him like it was the most natural thing in the world. "My late husband was a Marine," she'd said, pouring coffee that was actually hot, actually fresh. "Vietnam. He came home different. Took him years to find his feet again." She hadn't pressed, hadn't asked Wesley's story, hadn't offered unwanted advice, just shared coffee and companionship for 20 minutes, then collected her thermos and gone back inside. After that, she'd nod to him when she saw him, a small acknowledgement that he was a person worth acknowledging. Wesley had seen her talking to Lillian several times, the 2 women clearly friends despite the difference in their ages. Father Miguel Santos was the 3rd pillar of Wesley's fragile support system. The priest was younger than most people expected, maybe 40, with the weathered hands of someone who'd done hard labor before finding his calling. He'd emigrated from El Salvador as a teenager, built a life through a combination of determination and faith, and now ran St. Augustine's with a practical compassion that extended far beyond Sunday services. He'd never asked Wesley to convert, attend services, or perform any religious rituals. He'd simply offered work in exchange for food, cleaning gutters, repairing fence boards, reorganizing the storage basement, and treated Wesley like a skilled contractor rather than charity case. "I need someone I can trust," Father Miguel had said the first time. "Someone who shows up, does good work, doesn't steal. That's you." It was the first time in 3 years someone had said they trusted Wesley. He'd worked 10 hours that day for a hot meal and $50, and felt wealthier than he had since leaving the service. But today, something had shifted in the careful balance of Wesley's observation. He'd been returning from his usual dumpster rounds when he'd seen a man enter Lillian's office building. Late 40s, expensive suit, the kind of confident stride that came from never being questioned. Wesley might not have paid attention except for Sargent. The dog had stopped dead, stiffening, a sound emerging from his throat that Wesley had only heard once before in combat, when enemy fighters were approaching their position. Wesley had pulled Sargent behind a parked car, watching. The man had emerged 20 minutes later with Lillian, and even from across the street, Wesley could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone preparing for a blow. They'd stood outside the building talking, and while Wesley couldn't hear the words, he could read body language. The man was threatening her. Not overtly, his hands never moved aggressively. His face maintained a pleasant expression, but there was something in his posture, the way he leaned in just slightly too close, that screamed intimidation. Lillian had held her ground, but when the man finally left, she'd sagged against the building wall like a puppet with cut strings. That evening, Father Miguel had mentioned that Lillian was coming by the church to discuss expanding the foundation's support for homeless veterans. Wesley had been replacing roof shingles when she'd arrived. He'd stayed on the roof, out of sight but within earshot. What he'd heard had made his blood run cold. "Someone named Owen Briggs has been threatening me," Lillian had told Father Miguel, her voice shaking. "He claims my father owed him something. Money, or information, or I don't know what, but he keeps saying I have what belongs to him, and if I don't turn it over, he'll make me regret it." Wesley's hands had frozen on the hammer. Owen Briggs. Colonel Owen Briggs. The name detonated in Wesley's memory like an IED, bringing with it the smell of burning fuel and the screams of dying men. That name belonged to a ghost, a coward, a man who should have been court-martialed but had instead received an honorable discharge and a pension. Wesley had served under Briggs, had watched him abandon his unit, had survived only because someone else had been willing to make the sacrifice Briggs should have made. And now that name was connected to the woman with kind eyes who fed homeless veterans. The woman Sargent watched with inexplicable recognition. The woman who was clearly in danger. Wesley had climbed down from the roof in a daze, Sargent pressing against his leg, sensing his distress. He'd spent the rest of the evening trying to convince himself it was coincidence, that there could be multiple Owen Briggs in the world, that the past didn't reach forward to poison the present. But he knew better. Combat had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that Lillian Foster was in immediate danger from a man who had already proven himself capable of letting good people die to save his own skin. That was why, when Wesley had heard her frightened voice in the parking garage, when he'd seen the men moving to take her, when he'd had 45 seconds to decide, the decision had already been made. Some debts transcended homelessness, skin color, and fear. Some debts could only be paid by standing between the innocent and the wolves, regardless of the cost. Sargent moved first. The dog crossed the distance between the pillar and the attackers in 3 powerful bounds, hitting the man with the knife from the side with enough force to knock him sprawling. The knife clattered across the concrete, spinning into darkness. Wesley was already moving, his body remembering rhythms his mind had tried to forget. The second man turned toward the commotion and caught Wesley's elbow across his jaw. A precise strike that sent him stumbling backward into a parked car. The third man was faster, more trained, and he had his hand on Lillian's arm when Wesley reached him. Wesley grabbed the man's wrist, applied pressure to the nerve cluster, and felt the hand release. The man swung with his free hand, but Wesley had fought people who actually knew what they were doing. He blocked, redirected, and swept the man's legs. 3 men down in less than 15 seconds. Sargent stood over the knife wielder, teeth bared, daring him to move. Lillian had her back pressed against her Mercedes, eyes wide, breath coming in gasps. And standing at the edge of the parking garage, still in shadow, Owen Briggs watched with an expression of cold fury. Wesley recognized him instantly despite the years and the expensive tailoring. The same weak chin hidden now by a carefully trimmed beard. The same pale eyes that had looked at dying men with calculation rather than compassion. Briggs met Wesley's gaze for one long moment, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or concern that his operation had been interrupted. Then he simply turned and walked away, melting into the November darkness like he'd never been there at all. The 3 attackers scrambled to their feet and ran, limping and cursing, following their employer's retreat. Wesley wanted to chase them, wanted to drag Briggs back and make him answer for every sin, old and new. But Lillian was sliding down the side of her car, shock setting in, and Wesley's priority crystallized. He moved to her slowly, hands visible, keeping distance, aware of how this looked. A homeless black man approaching a wealthy white woman in a dark parking garage. The optics were terrible, even if the reality was salvation. Lillian looked up at him, and Wesley saw the moment her fear shifted from the men who'd tried to take her to uncertainty about the man who'd saved her. He couldn't blame her. He knew what he looked like: worn jeans, layered thrift store jackets, 3 days of beard growth, the unmistakable patina of living rough. "Ma'am," he said quietly, keeping his voice level and non-threatening. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you?" She shook her head, still processing, still trying to understand what had just happened. Sargent approached her carefully, no longer in attack mode, and did something Wesley had never seen him do with a stranger. The dog sat down directly in front of Lillian and placed his head on her knee, a gesture of protection and comfort that was entirely unprompted. Lillian's hand moved automatically to touch Sargent's head, and something in her expression softened. "You saved me," she said, looking from the dog to Wesley. "You both saved me." Before Wesley could respond, headlights swept across them, and a police cruiser pulled into the parking garage, lights flashing. The 2 officers who emerged from the cruiser took in the scene with the kind of instant assessment that Wesley recognized from his own military training. They saw a well-dressed white woman, clearly shaken, sitting on the ground. They saw a homeless black man standing over her. Their hands moved to their weapons. "Step away from her," the first officer commanded, his voice sharp with authority and assumption. "Hands where I can see them." Wesley's heart sank, but his hands rose smoothly, slowly, no sudden movements. This was a dance he'd learned. Comply. Don't argue. Survive the encounter, and sort truth out later if you're lucky. "Officers, this man saved me," Lillian said, struggling to her feet. "There were 3 men attacking me. He fought them off." The second officer, younger, kept his eyes on Wesley. "Ma'am, are you sure? Sometimes in stressful situations people can become confused about what happened." The implication was clear and insulting. Lillian heard it too. Wesley watched her spine straighten, watched the vulnerability leave her face and something harder replace it. "I am extremely sure, officer. I am Lillian Foster. I run the Foster Foundation 3 blocks from here. I was attacked by 3 men who attempted to abduct me. This man, whose name I don't even know yet, intervened and saved my life. His dog attacked my assailants. If you want to arrest someone, I suggest you put out an APB for 3 men who fled north on foot approximately 3 minutes ago." The authority in her voice, the name drop of her foundation, the precise details, it all shifted the dynamic. The officers relaxed fractionally but didn't quite holster their weapons. "We got a call about a disturbance," the first officer said. "We need to take statements from everyone." More headlights announced another arrival. Nora Patterson's ancient Volvo pulled into the garage, and the elderly woman emerged with surprising speed. "Lillian!" I heard the commotion from my window. "Are you all right?" She took in the scene: the police, Wesley's raised hands, Lillian's disheveled appearance, and her expression hardened. "Officers, I witnessed the entire incident from my building. I've already called it in to your dispatcher with a description of the attackers. This man is a hero, not a suspect. Lower your weapons and show some decency." Nora Patterson might have been 73, but she spoke with the commanding presence of someone who'd spent 50 years telling doctors what to do in emergency rooms. The officers complied, finally holstering their guns. The next 20 minutes were an exercise in frustration. Wesley gave his statement clearly and concisely, sticking to facts, volunteering nothing that wasn't asked. The officers took notes, but Wesley could read skepticism in their body language. When he mentioned seeing a 4th man, an older man who'd been coordinating the attack, the first officer's pen actually stopped moving. "A 4th man," the officer repeated, tone flat. "Did you get a good look at him?" Wesley hesitated. If he named Owen Briggs, a respected businessman, against 3 years of being a homeless nobody, who would they believe? "It was dark," Wesley said carefully. "I couldn't see his face clearly. It wasn't exactly a lie." The officer nodded, looking almost relieved not to have to follow that thread. They took Lillian's statement, then Nora's. A detective was called. More questions were asked. Throughout it all, Wesley stood with his hands loose at his sides. Sargent pressed against his leg, both of them simply enduring. Finally, the lead detective, a tired-looking woman named Chen, closed her notebook. "Mr. Carter, you're free to go. We have your information if we need to follow up." "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you consider personal security, at least temporarily. This appears to have been a targeted attack, not a random mugging." Lillian nodded, then turned to Wesley. "Please wait. Don't leave yet." Wesley wanted to disappear into the night, to return to his alley, and process everything that had just happened. But something in Lillian's voice held him in place. The police finally left, taking with them their judgmental stares and barely concealed prejudice. Nora gave Lillian a long hug, extracted a promise that she'd call in the morning, and drove away with a nod to Wesley that might have been respect. That left Wesley, Sargent, and Lillian alone in the parking garage. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving Wesley shaky and exhausted. "I need to know your name," Lillian said. "Wesley Carter, ma'am." She offered her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Wesley shook it. Her grip was firm, her palm warm. "Thank you, Wesley. Thank you for not walking away. Thank you for risking yourself for a stranger." Wesley nodded, not trusting his voice. "Those men will come back," Lillian continued. "The detective was right. This was planned. And you saw the fourth man, the one you didn't describe to the police. You know who he is, don't you?" Wesley met her eyes. "I think so." "Yes." Lillian's jaw tightened. "Owen Briggs." It wasn't a question. Wesley felt his world tilt. "How do you know that name?" Lillian laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because he's been threatening me for weeks. Because he claims my father owed him something. Because he's decided I have information he needs, and he won't stop until he gets it or I'm dead." She paused, studying Wesley's face. "But you knew that name before I said it. You've encountered him before." Wesley's mind raced through possibilities, through consequences, through danger zones he'd sworn never to enter again. But Sargent made the decision for him. The dog stood, walked to Lillian, and sat down beside her with the same protective posture he used with Wesley. The message was clear. This person needs us. This person is Pack. Wesley had learned to trust the dog's instincts above his own. "Yes, ma'am. I know him. I served under Colonel Briggs. And if he's threatening you, then you're in more danger than you realize. That man has killed before by abandonment and cowardice. He won't hesitate to do it again through more direct means." Lillian absorbed this, and Wesley watched her process the implications. "My house isn't safe," she said slowly. "He knows where I live. The Foundation office definitely isn't safe. The police can't help because I have no proof of his threats. And he's too connected, too wealthy, too respected." Wesley nodded. This was a tactical problem, and despite the years, despite the homelessness, his training reasserted itself. "You need to get somewhere. He can't easily reach you. Somewhere isolated where approach would be visible. And you need to go now. Tonight. Those men failed, which means he'll escalate." Lillian looked at him for a long moment. "Come with me, please. I have a property in Hudson Valley, a house my father left me. It's remote, surrounded by forest. If Briggs comes, we'll see him coming." Wesley took a step back. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but that's not a good idea. A homeless black man accompanying a wealthy white woman to an isolated house? The optics alone," Lillian cut him off. "The optics alone suggest I'm a woman whose life is in danger being protected by a trained soldier. Everything else is noise and prejudice. I'm not asking you to compromise yourself. I'm asking you to help me survive. And I'm asking because I trust the instincts of this dog, who clearly trusts you completely." Sargent, as if on cue, looked up at Wesley with an expression that somehow managed to convey both encouragement and inevitability. The dog had never been wrong before. Wesley thought about Owen Briggs walking away into the darkness. Thought about the precision of that attack. Thought about a wealthy, connected man who would face no consequences if Lillian disappeared, and an inconvenient homeless witness died in some unrelated incident. Thought about a debt 20 years old to a man who'd given his life so Wesley could live. "I'll help," Wesley said quietly. "But we leave now, and we assume we're already being watched." Lillian nodded and pulled out her phone. I need to make one call. To Father Miguel. I want him to know where we're going, and I want to tell him why. 5 minutes later, they were in Lillian's Mercedes, Sargent in the back seat, driving north out of the city. Wesley kept checking the mirrors for pursuit. Lillian's hands were tight on the steering wheel. "Tell me about my father," she said as the city lights faded behind them. "Tell me about Lieutenant Foster." Wesley closed his eyes. "Your father was the bravest man I ever served with, ma'am. And yes, I'll tell you about him. But first you need to tell me what Owen Briggs is really after. Because men like him don't threaten women like you over money. There's something else. Something worth killing for." Lillian was quiet for so long Wesley thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father left me a box. A locked box I was only supposed to open on my 50th birthday. I opened it 3 months ago." She paused. It contained his war journal, and evidence that Owen Briggs is a traitor, a thief, and a murderer. "My father documented everything before he died. And now, Briggs knows I have it." The Hudson Valley house appeared through the trees like something from a different era, a stone and timber structure that had weathered decades of seasons with dignity. Lillian pulled into the gravel driveway and killed the engine. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down. Wesley scanned the perimeter automatically, cataloging sight lines, defensive positions, approach vectors, old habits. Sargent was already alert in the back seat, nose working, processing scents through the cracked window. The forest pressed close on 3 sides, dense with pine and hardwood. The 4th side opened onto a rocky slope that dropped away to a valley below. Defensible, Wesley thought, but also isolated. If Briggs came with enough men, they'd be trapped. "The nearest neighbor is 4 miles that way," Lillian said, pointing east. "The main road is 2 miles back the way we came. Cell service is spotty at best." She looked at Wesley. "I know what you're thinking. This is a tactical nightmare." Wesley allowed himself a small smile. "It has advantages, limited approaches, natural barriers. If we're smart about it, isolation becomes an asset." They went inside, and Lillian turned on lights, revealing a space that was both rustic and elegant. Stone fireplace, exposed beams, furniture that looked comfortable rather than expensive. "My father built this place," Lillian said. "After he came back from the war, he wanted somewhere quiet." She moved to a bookshelf and removed several volumes, revealing a small safe built into the wall behind them. Her fingers worked the combination, and the door swung open. She withdrew a worn journal bound in green canvas and a manila envelope thick with documents. Lillian set both items on the heavy wooden table that dominated the main room. Wesley found himself drawn forward despite every instinct telling him this was dangerous knowledge. Sargent positioned himself by the door, still on guard. "Lieutenant Marcus Foster," Lillian began, opening the journal with reverent hands. "My father. He died 4 months before I was born, which makes me 49 years old and only recently in possession of his final words." She turned pages filled with neat handwriting, sketches of landscapes, pressed flowers that had long since lost their color. "He wrote this during his final deployment. He knew he might not come home. He wanted me to know him, to understand what he fought for and why it mattered." Wesley's throat tightened. He'd been 23 when Marcus Foster had saved his life and the lives of 11 other men. The lieutenant had been 34, married less than 2 years, with a baby on the way he'd talked about constantly. Wesley had envied that certainty, that knowledge of something good waiting at home. "I knew your father," Wesley said quietly. "I served in his unit. He was our platoon leader during Operation Copper Canyon." Lillian's hand froze on the journal. She looked up at Wesley, with eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "You knew him? You actually knew my father?" Wesley nodded. "He saved my life, ma'am. Saved all of us. We were pinned down by enemy fire in a compound outside Kandahar. Our commanding officer had called a retreat, said the position was lost, and we needed to fall back. But that would have meant leaving 3 wounded men behind. Your father refused the order." The memory came back sharp and painful. The smell of burning diesel and copper blood. The sound of automatic weapons fire ricocheting off stone walls. The radio, crackling with Colonel Briggs's voice ordering immediate withdrawal, saving his own skin while leaving soldiers to die. Marcus Foster had looked at that radio, looked at his men, and made a choice. He told us to take the wounded and run, Wesley continued. Said he'd cover our retreat. We argued. He pulled rank, made it an order. Then he grabbed a rifle and grenades and charged the enemy position alone. Wesley's voice cracked. He killed 6 insurgents and disabled their heavy weapon. Gave us the time we needed to get clear. But he took 3 rounds doing it. We came back for him, but he was already gone. Lillian's tears fell freely now. The army told my mother he died a hero. They gave her a flag and a medal and words that meant nothing without him. She died when I was 7. I grew up with grandparents who loved me but couldn't fill the hole where my parents should have been. She touched the journal. This was all I had of him, and when I finally read it, when I finally understood what he'd documented here, I realized his death wasn't just heroic. It was also convenient. She opened the journal to a marked page. 3 weeks before he died, my father discovered that Colonel Owen Briggs was running an illegal weapons trafficking operation, selling military hardware to local warlords, pocketing the money, creating a private fortune built on American blood and treasure. The entries were detailed, dates and times and transaction records, copied from files Marcus Foster had clearly accessed covertly. My father was going to report it through official channels. He'd gathered evidence, prepared his case. But then came Operation Copper Canyon, and my father ended up dead while saving his unit from a mission that Briggs himself had ordered, knowing it was compromised. Wesley felt sick. He'd suspected Briggs was a coward. He'd known the colonel had abandoned them, but he'd never imagined the full scope of the betrayal. Briggs set you up, Wesley said. He sent your father's unit into that compound knowing it was a trap, hoping everyone would die and his crimes would die with them. Lillian nodded. The journal suggests exactly that, and the documents my father collected, procurement records, financial transactions, communications logs, they prove it. Briggs should have been court-martialed, should have been imprisoned. Instead, he retired with honors, used his dirty money to build a business empire, and has spent 25 years as a pillar of the community. Wesley's hands clenched into fists. Sargent sensed the anger and patted over, pressing against Wesley's leg. The contact grounded him, pulled him back from the rage. How did Briggs find out you have this? Lillian stood and moved to the window, looking out at the dark forest. I made a mistake. 3 months ago, after reading the journal, I contacted the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. I wanted justice. I wanted my father's sacrifice to mean something beyond just saving lives in that moment. I wanted the man who killed him to pay. She turned back to Wesley. But Briggs still has friends in the military. Someone tipped him off. Within a week, he showed up at my office. Very polite, very reasonable. Said he'd heard I'd come into possession of some documents that might be historically interesting but factually questionable. Suggested that dragging my father's name through a scandal would dishonor his memory. Made it clear that if I pursued this, he had resources to make my life very difficult. Wesley could imagine the scene. Briggs with his practiced charm, his veneer of respectability, his underlying threat wrapped in concern. You didn't back down, Wesley said. It wasn't a question. Lillian laughed bitterly. I told him to go to hell. I'm my father's daughter. I don't respond well to bullies. So, Briggs escalated. Anonymous threats. Dead animals left on my doorstep. My car keyed. My office broken into, though nothing taken. Psychological warfare designed to make me afraid, to make me compliant. The pattern was clear and professional. Briggs was tightening the noose, increasing pressure, building toward violence while maintaining deniability. Tonight's attempted kidnapping was the next logical step. Take Lillian, force her to turn over the evidence, then eliminate the witness. Clean and efficient if it had worked. We need to get this to the authorities, Wesley said. Real authorities. FBI, maybe. Someone beyond Briggs's reach. Lillian shook her head. I tried. The Army CID case is stalled pending review, which means buried. Local police can't act without evidence of an immediate crime. And Briggs has been careful to keep his hands clean. The FBI won't touch a 25-year-old military case without compelling new evidence or a clear federal crime. She gestured at the journal and documents. All I have are my father's notes and circumstantial documentation. A good lawyer would tear it apart. Briggs knows that. He's not trying to stop a prosecution. He's trying to protect his reputation. Wesley processed this. So he doesn't just want the evidence destroyed. He wants you discredited or dead. Preferably both. The bluntness of it hung in the air. Lillian nodded slowly. Yes. And now, he knows you're involved. A homeless veteran with a history of violence, sorry. But that's how it will be spun, who coincidentally served under my father. Briggs will use that. If something happens to me, you become the obvious suspect. Wesley hadn't considered that angle, but she was right. He'd walked directly into a frame. A black man, already marginalized and presumed dangerous, connected to a wealthy white woman who ends up dead. The story would write itself. No one would look for Owen Briggs behind the convenient scapegoat. We're both targets now, Wesley said. Which means we need to change the game, stop reacting, and start acting. Lillian raised an eyebrow. What do you suggest? Wesley moved to the map of the Hudson Valley that hung on one wall. Briggs sent 3 men tonight and they failed. He'll send more, and they'll be better prepared. He knows you're gone, and he'll start checking your properties. This house is probably already on his list. He traced routes on the map. We have maybe 12 hours before he finds us here. We can use that time to run farther, or we can use it to prepare a defense and force his hand. Sargent stood and walked to the map, looking up at Wesley with an intensity that suggested the dog understood more than should be possible. Prepare how? Lillian asked. Wesley's mind was already working tactically, planning fields of fire and fallback positions. We make this house a fortress. We document everything on video. Establish a dead man's switch with someone trustworthy. We make it clear that if anything happens to us, the evidence goes public immediately. And then we wait for Briggs to make his move, and we make sure there are witnesses he can't silence. Lillian considered this. That's incredibly dangerous. Wesley met her eyes. Ma'am, the moment I stepped in to help you tonight, the danger was inevitable. Your father died saving me and 11 other men. If I have to stand between his daughter and the man who killed him, that's not danger. That's duty. Something shifted in Lillian's expression, a softening that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with recognition. You loved him. My father. You actually loved him. Wesley felt tears prick his eyes and didn't bother hiding them. Every man in that unit loved Lieutenant Foster. He was the kind of leader who made you want to be better, braver, more decent. He saw the best in people and called it forward. And when the moment came, he didn't hesitate. He just acted, because that's who he was. They stood in silence, the weight of shared loss and shared purpose settling between them. Finally, Lillian spoke. Then we do this. We prepare. We fight. And we make sure Owen Briggs finally pays for what he took from us. Wesley nodded and pulled out his phone. It had been 3 years since he'd used Father Miguel's number for anything except occasional text messages, but the priest answered on the second ring. Wesley explained the situation in terse sentences, leaving nothing out. Father Miguel listened without interruption, and when Wesley finished, the priest's response was immediate. I will contact FBI Field Agent Martinez. She attends our church and has been looking for a reason to investigate Briggs for years. She's clean, can't be bought. I'll tell her everything and make sure she knows that if anything happens to you or Lillian, the evidence goes public through the church. Relief flooded through Wesley. Thank you, Father. Father Miguel's voice softened. Wesley, you are not invisible. You are not disposable. You are a child of God and a hero whether you believe it or not. Come back safe. Wesley hung up and turned to Lillian. We have a backup plan now, but we still need to fortify this house and prepare for company. They worked through the night. Lillian had security cameras in storage, a remnant of a previous security concern. Wesley installed them at key points around the property, angling them to cover approaches. They tested the cell signal in different parts of the house and found one corner of the upper floor where they could reliably get 2 bars. They inventoried supplies, food for 3 days, plenty of water, a first aid kit, flashlights, batteries. Lillian had her father's old hunting rifle in a locked cabinet, along with ammunition. Wesley checked the weapon, found it well maintained, and loaded it. Sargent patrolled constantly, moving from window to window, his internal threat assessment system running continuously. As dawn broke, painting the valley in shades of gold and rose, Wesley stood on the porch and studied the landscape. The beauty was deceptive. Those trees provided cover for approach. That rocky slope limited escape routes. The isolation that had seemed like safety now felt like exposure. Lillian joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I haven't thanked you properly," she said. "For believing me, for helping me, for trusting that I wasn't crazy or paranoid." Wesley accepted the coffee gratefully. "Ma'am, a man who's lived on the streets knows the difference between paranoia and justified fear. You're not imagining this threat. And besides," he gestured to Sargent, who sat between them like a furry mediator, "this dog has never been wrong about danger. If he trusts you, I trust you." Lillian smiled and reached down to scratch Sargent's ears. The dog leaned into her touch, content in a way Wesley had rarely seen. "Why does he react to me like this?" Lillian asked. "He doesn't know me. We only met last night." Wesley had been wondering the same thing. Military working dogs bond with their handlers. They learn to trust specific scents, specific energy. Sargent was discharged for being overprotective of people he perceived as vulnerable. Maybe he senses something in you that triggers that instinct. But even as he said it, Wesley knew it was more than that. There was something almost uncanny in how Sargent had immediately adopted Lillian into his pack, how the dog positioned himself to protect her with the same intensity he protected Wesley. They went back inside as the sun climbed higher. Wesley positioned himself at the window with the best sight lines, the rifle within reach, Sargent at his feet. Lillian worked at the table, scanning her father's documents, organizing them into a coherent case file. Hours passed in tense silence. Wesley's military training kept him alert despite the fatigue. "Watch for movement. Monitor approaches. Stay ready." At noon, Sargent's head snapped up, ears forward. Wesley was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Someone's coming," he said quietly. Lillian moved away from the windows, positioning herself in the interior hallway as Wesley had instructed during their planning session. Wesley watched the tree line. For long minutes, nothing. Then he saw it, a flash of light reflecting off metal or glass. Someone was surveilling them from the forest. "They're here," Wesley said. "Stay calm. Stay ready. Remember, we're documenting everything." Lillian pulled out her phone and started recording. The security cameras were already capturing footage, uploading to a cloud server that Father Miguel had access to. Whatever happened next, there would be evidence. The first vehicle appeared on the road at 12:30, a black SUV, moving slowly, clearly searching. It passed the driveway without stopping, but Wesley knew they'd been spotted. They would circle back. 15 minutes later, 2 SUVs appeared. They pulled into the driveway, and 4 men emerged. Not the same men from last night. These were professionals, former military or law enforcement based on how they moved. They spread out, covering angles, communicating with hand signals. Wesley recognized the tactics. These men were trained for assault and extraction. Briggs had upgraded his resources. The front door shook with heavy pounding. "Miss Foster, we're private security hired to ensure your safety. We need you to come with us." The voice was authoritative, reasonable, exactly the tone designed to make compliance seem logical. Lillian looked at Wesley. He shook his head. "FBI is en route." Wesley called through the door. "Miss Foster is safe. You need to leave this property." Silence. Then, "Sir, we don't want any trouble. Mr. Briggs is concerned for Miss Foster's well-being. We just need to speak with her." Wesley's finger moved near the rifle's trigger guard. "Mr. Briggs attempted to have Miss Foster kidnapped last night. She's filing charges. You're trespassing. Leave now." More silence. Then the sound of footsteps retreating. Wesley watched through the window as the 4 men conferred, radios in hand. They were calling for instructions. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be negotiation. "They're going to try to force entry," Wesley told Lillian. "When they do, we need to be ready to defend ourselves and document everything." "Your phone recording?" Lillian nodded, hands shaking but steady. "Recording and uploading in real time to the cloud." Sargent growled low, his attention fixed on the back of the house. Wesley processed this. "They're splitting up. Some coming front, some going around back. Classic breach tactic." The sound of breaking glass came from the rear bedroom. Sargent barked once, sharp and aggressive. Wesley moved to intercept but kept his position covering the front. The door shuddered as someone hit it with force, a battering ram, probably. One more hit, and it would give way. Wesley made a decision. He fired the rifle once, straight up through the ceiling, the report deafening in the enclosed space. "Next shot won't be a warning," he shouted. The assault paused. Wesley could hear urgent radio chatter. These men were professionals, but they weren't suicidal. A gunshot changed calculations. Then a new voice, amplified by a bullhorn from outside. "Wesley Carter, this is Special Agent Catherine Martinez, FBI. Hold your fire. Identify yourself and your situation." Relief crashed through Wesley, so intense he almost staggered. "Agent Martinez." Wesley Carter, inside with Lillian Foster, were under attack by armed men claiming to be private security. 4 individuals, possibly more. Martinez's voice came back, clipped and authoritative. "Armed individuals at 4782 Ridge Road. Identify yourselves and stand down immediately. You are interfering with a federal investigation." The sound of vehicles starting. Through the window, Wesley watched the SUVs peel out of the driveway, the 4 men retreating rapidly. Within seconds they were gone, leaving only tire tracks and broken glass as evidence of their presence. 3 FBI vehicles pulled in seconds later. Wesley set the rifle down carefully, hands visible, knowing that federal agents with drawn weapons didn't care about context until after securing a scene. Agent Martinez was a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. She entered with her weapon drawn, but lowered it when she saw Wesley's hands empty and up. "Mr. Carter? Miss Foster?" They both nodded. Martinez holstered her weapon and immediately began directing her team. "Secure the perimeter, document the scene, get forensics on those tire tracks. Someone find me those SUV plates from the security cameras." She turned to Lillian and Wesley. "Father Miguel Santos called me at 6 this morning with a very interesting story about corruption, attempted kidnapping, and a 25-year-old war crime. I've spent the last 6 hours pulling every string I have to fast-track a federal investigation into Owen Briggs. When his men showed up here, they gave me the probable cause I needed." Lillian sagged against the wall, the adrenaline crash hitting hard. Wesley moved to support her, and Sargent pressed against both of them, his job done, his pack safe. Martinez studied them. "You two look like hell. When's the last time either of you slept?" Wesley couldn't remember. "Last night. Maybe. Some." Martinez snorted. "Thought so. Here's what happens now. You're both going into protective custody while we build a case. The evidence you have, Miss Foster, I need all of it. Every document, every recording, every piece of your father's journal. And Mr. Carter, I need your testimony about Operation Copper Canyon and Colonel Briggs's actions. Between what you witnessed and what Lieutenant Foster documented, we can bury this man." The next hours passed in a blur of statements, evidence transfer, and coordination. Martinez was thorough and professional, treating Wesley with the respect he hadn't experienced from law enforcement in years. Lillian provided the journal and documents, watching them be cataloged with the reverence they deserved. Wesley gave his statement about the mission where Marcus Foster died, the details still sharp despite the decades. He described Briggs's cowardice, the ordered retreat that would have meant leaving wounded behind, Foster's refusal and ultimate sacrifice. He documented tonight's events, last night's attempted kidnapping, everything. As the sun set on their second day at the house, Martinez returned from coordinating with her team. "Owen Briggs has been arrested. We picked him up at his office 2 hours ago. He's being charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping, witness intimidation, and we're building cases for the historical crimes, weapons trafficking, dereliction of duty, negligent homicide. It's going to take time, but we have enough to hold him." Lillian's breath caught. "He's actually in custody? It's really over?" Martinez held up a cautionary hand. "The arrest phase is over. The legal battle is just beginning. Briggs has money and lawyers. This will be a fight. But I've been trying to nail this man for 8 years, and thanks to your father's documentation and Mr. Carter's testimony, we finally have the ammunition to do it." Wesley felt something unfamiliar hope. Not the fragile, easily crushed variety he'd occasionally entertained during his years on the street, but something more solid. Something that might actually last. Martinez turned to Wesley. Father Miguel mentioned your living situation. I've spoken with the VA on your behalf. Apparently, your paperwork wasn't lost. It was deliberately misfiled by a clerk who was, coincidentally, on Briggs's payroll. We're fixing that. Your benefits are being reinstated, backdated 3 years. You're also being considered for a commendation based on tonight's actions. Wesley couldn't speak, couldn't process. 3 years of fighting for recognition, for basic dignity, and it had taken one phone call from the right person to fix what should never have been broken. Lillian crossed to Wesley and took his hands. You saved my life. You believed me. You stood with me against a man who had every advantage. I will spend the rest of my life making sure the world knows what kind of hero you are. Wesley shook his head. Ma'am, I'm not. Sergeant barked once, interrupting, and Wesley couldn't help but laugh. Even the dog was arguing with him. Okay, Wesley said. Maybe I did something right. For once. Martinez smiled. Mr. Carter, I've read your service record. You did something right for 20 years in the military, and you've been doing something right every day since, surviving circumstances that would break most people. Tonight you just happened to do something right that the world got to witness. She paused. Father Miguel also mentioned you might need a job. The FBI has a contractor position for security consultants, teaching agents about survival in austere conditions, threat assessment, that kind of thing. Interested? Wesley looked at Sergeant, who looked back with what might have been approval. He looked at Lillian, who was smiling through tears. He looked at Agent Martinez, who was offering him a path back to purpose. Yes, ma'am, Wesley said. Very interested. The night settled over the Hudson Valley house, but the darkness felt different now. Less oppressive. Less lonely. Wesley stood on the porch with Sergeant, looking at stars he'd stopped noticing during his years on the street. Lillian joined them, wrapped in a blanket against the autumn chill. What happens tomorrow? She asked. Wesley considered. Tomorrow we start over. New day, new beginning. Lillian nodded. Together? You and Sergeant will stay? At least until this is all settled? Wesley looked down at the dog, who had somehow known from the beginning that Lillian was family, was pack, was someone worth protecting. Yeah, Wesley said. We'll stay, for as long as you need us. Lillian's smile was radiant. I need you to understand something, Wesley. My father died protecting people he led. You protected people he loved me. His legacy. His honor. That's not a debt to be repaid. That's family, and family doesn't leave. Wesley felt something break open in his chest, some hard shell of isolation and pain that had calcified over 3 years of rejection and survival. For the first time since he'd lost everything, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have something again. Not what he'd lost. Something different. Something chosen rather than assigned. Sergeant pressed against both of them, completing the triangle. And Wesley understood that the dog had known this was coming all along, had recognized in Lillian something Wesley had been too damaged to see: the possibility of home, the possibility of belonging, the possibility that loyalty and courage could build something stronger than what hatred and prejudice could tear down. Thank you, Wesley said to both of them. For seeing me when I'd become invisible, for trusting me when I'd stopped trusting myself. For reminding me that I'm more than my worst circumstances. Lillian leaned her head on Wesley's shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that felt both foreign and exactly right. You were never invisible, Wesley. You were just waiting for someone who knew how to look. The weeks following Owen Briggs's arrest transformed Wesley's life in ways he was still struggling to comprehend. The VA benefits came through with bureaucratic speed that suggested someone important was pushing paperwork. Suddenly, Wesley had healthcare, had back pay, had resources he'd been denied for 3 years through deliberate sabotage. Agent Martinez personally apologized for the system's failure, explaining that the clerk who'd buried his file had received regular payments from a shell company traced back to Briggs. Apparently, the colonel had been systematically targeting veterans who'd served under him, keeping them marginalized and silent. Wesley hadn't been the only one. There were 8 others, scattered across the country, all with mysteriously lost paperwork, all from Operation Copper Canyon. Martinez was contacting each of them, rectifying injustices, building a broader case against Briggs that went beyond a single night's violence. Lillian had insisted Wesley and Sargent move into the guest house on her main estate, a converted carriage house that was larger and more comfortable than anywhere Wesley had lived in years. He'd resisted at first, the old fears about optics and assumptions rising up, but Lillian had been immovable. "My father saved you so you could save me," she'd said. "That makes us family by any definition that matters. Family doesn't let family sleep in alleys." Wesley had accepted, and for the first time in years, he'd slept through the night without waking to check for threats. The media attention had been intense and uncomfortable. News outlets loved the story. Homeless veteran saves wealthy woman, exposes decades-old military corruption. They wanted interviews, wanted Wesley to play the role of inspirational figure rising from adversity. Wesley had declined most requests, but Agent Martinez had convinced him to do one carefully controlled interview with a respected journalist. "Your story matters," Martinez had said, "not just for the case against Briggs, but for every veteran who's been failed by the system. You make people care, Wesley. Use that." The interview had aired 2 weeks ago, and the response had been overwhelming. Donations to homeless veteran organizations had spiked. Politicians suddenly cared about VA reform. And Wesley's phone, the new phone Lillian had given him, had rung constantly with messages from old Army buddies he'd lost touch with, from strangers offering support, from veterans sharing their own stories of abandonment and survival. Father Miguel had called, his voice thick with emotion, saying the church had received enough donations to expand their shelter program by 50%. Nora Patterson had organized a neighborhood watch program and recruited Wesley to train volunteers in threat recognition. The community that had overlooked him for 3 years now wanted to celebrate him, and Wesley wasn't sure how to feel about that. The transformation in Sargent was equally remarkable. The dog that had been so protective, so wary, so ready for violence, had relaxed into something approaching normal canine behavior. He still shadowed Wesley constantly, still slept across the doorway of whatever room Wesley occupied, but the hair-trigger alertness had eased. Sargent played now, chasing tennis balls in Lillian's yard, splashing in the creek that ran through the property, rolling in grass with the pure joy of a creature finally feeling safe. Veterinarian examinations revealed old injuries that had healed badly, arthritis that had gone untreated, dental problems from years of inadequate care. Lillian had paid for everything without hesitation, and Wesley had stopped arguing about money after the 3rd round. "My foundation exists to help veterans," Lillian had said firmly. "That includes their service animals. This isn't charity, Wesley. This is what the foundation is supposed to do." The bond between Lillian and Sargent had only deepened. The dog would spend hours lying at her feet while she worked, would follow her through the house with devoted attention, would position himself between her and any stranger with protective certainty. It was as if Sargent understood, on some instinctive level, that Lillian was connected to the man who'd saved Wesley's life, that protecting her was completing a mission that had begun decades ago on a battlefield neither of them had seen. The trial preparation consumed much of Wesley's time. He spent hours with prosecutors, reviewing his testimony, clarifying details, preparing for the aggressive cross-examination Briggs's defense team would certainly employ. They would attack his credibility, his mental state, his years of homelessness. They would try to paint him as unstable, unreliable, motivated by revenge or mental illness. Wesley's attorney, provided by Lillian but fiercely independent, had been blunt about the challenges. "Briggs has money and connections. His lawyers are excellent. They're going to try to destroy you on the stand. But here's the thing, Wesley, you're telling the truth. Your story hasn't changed. The evidence supports everything you've said, and juries respond to authenticity. You just need to be yourself. Tell what happened, and trust that justice will follow." Wesley hoped she was right. He'd learned the hard way that justice wasn't always interested in truth, that systems could be corrupted, that money bought outcomes. But Lieutenant Foster's journal provided corroboration Wesley's testimony alone wouldn't have. The documents were damning, the paper trail clear. Briggs had trafficked weapons, pocketed money, and engineered the mission that killed Marcus Foster to cover his crimes. The evidence was overwhelming if people chose to believe it. Lillian had thrown herself into preparing her father's legacy. She'd contacted the 11 other survivors of Operation Copper Canyon, men scattered across the country who'd lived for 25 years not knowing why their lieutenant had sacrificed himself. The memorial service she organized brought them all together for the first time since the war. Wesley stood with those men, older now, grayer, carrying their own scars, visible and invisible, and watched as Lillian unveiled a memorial stone in the Hudson Valley House Garden. Lieutenant Marcus Foster's name was carved in granite, along with the names of his unit, the date of his death, and a single line from his journal that Lillian had chosen. Loyalty is measured not by what we promise, but by what we sacrifice. The ceremony was small, private, attended only by the veterans, their families, Father Miguel, Agent Martinez, and Nora Patterson. No media, no politicians, no one seeking credit or attention. Just the people whose lives Marcus Foster had touched, gathering to honor a man who'd chosen others over himself. Each veteran spoke, sharing memories of their lieutenant, stories of his leadership, his humor, his unwavering integrity. When Wesley's turn came, he spoke of the moment Foster had pulled rank and made saving the wounded an order, not a request. He knew some of us would try to stay with him, Wesley said, his voice breaking. Knew we'd die, trying to be heroes. So he made it impossible. Made it our duty to live. That's who Lieutenant Foster was, a man who understood that sometimes the hardest order to follow is the one that saves your life. After the service, the veterans lingered, sharing contact information, promising to stay in touch, forming connections that should have existed decades ago but were finally being built. Several approached Wesley privately, sharing their own stories of struggles after returning home, of systems that failed them, of slowly rebuilding lives from fragments. One man, a former sergeant named Thomas, gripped Wesley's shoulder. I was homeless for 2 years, Thomas said quietly. Slept in my car, ate from food banks, couldn't get help because my paperwork was mysteriously lost. Briggs did that to me too, to all of us from that mission. He wanted us scattered, struggling, unable to tell anyone what really happened. But you fought back, brother. You stood up when the rest of us had given up. That takes a kind of courage that has nothing to do with combat. Wesley didn't know how to respond to that, so he just hugged Thomas, and the embrace broke something loose in both of them. They cried together, two men who'd survived war and homelessness and systemic betrayal, finally acknowledging the cost of it all. Sergeant pushed between them, offering comfort with his presence, and other veterans reached out to touch the dog, to thank the animal who'd been part of the victory they were all celebrating. That night, after everyone had left, Wesley sat with Lillian on the porch of the main house, watching fireflies drift through the summer evening. The trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. Briggs's legal team was already making noise about traumatized veterans with unreliable memories, about circumstantial evidence and witch hunts against successful businessmen. Are you ready? Lillian asked. For the trial, for the scrutiny, for everything that's coming? Wesley considered the question honestly. I don't know if anyone's ever ready for something like this, but I know I'm telling the truth. I know your father deserves justice, and I know I'm not alone anymore. He looked at Sergeant, sleeping peacefully at their feet. I have you, have Father Miguel, have Agent Martinez, have all those veterans who came today. That's more support than I've had in years. So yeah, I guess I'm as ready as I'll ever be. Lillian reached over and took Wesley's hand, a gesture that had become comfortable between them, familial without presumption. My father would be so proud of you, not just for saving me, but for surviving everything you've survived. For maintaining your humanity when the world tried to strip it away. For being the kind of man who risks everything for strangers, because it's the right thing to do. Wesley's throat tightened. Your father was that kind of man. I'm just trying to live up to his example. Lillian shook her head. Wesley, you are that kind of man. You always were. You just forgot for a while because circumstances made you invisible. But you were never less than you are now. You were just waiting for the world to catch up and see what was always there. The wisdom in those words settled over Wesley like a benediction. He'd spent 3 years believing he'd lost himself, that homelessness had diminished him, that he'd become something less than the soldier he'd been. But maybe Lillian was right. Maybe he'd always been exactly who he was, and only the circumstances had changed. The core of him, the loyalty, the courage, the willingness to stand between the innocent and harm had never wavered. It had just been exercised in different ways, in survival rather than combat, in daily endurance rather than heroic action. But it had always been there, waiting for a moment when it would matter again. The trial, when it came, was exactly as brutal as Wesley had been warned. Briggs's lawyers were skilled and merciless. They questioned Wesley's mental health, his memory, his motivations. They suggested he was seeking attention, seeking money, seeking revenge for a career that hadn't gone as planned. They painted him as an unreliable witness, a broken man grasping for significance. Wesley sat in the witness box and took every attack with the same stoic endurance he'd learned on the streets. He didn't get angry, didn't get defensive, just answered every question honestly, calmly, with the detailed precision of someone telling the truth. When Briggs's lawyer suggested Wesley's homelessness indicated poor judgment and instability, Wesley looked directly at the jury. "Sir, I was homeless because the system failed me, and because Colonel Briggs deliberately sabotaged my benefits to keep me silent. I survived 3 years on the streets, not because I lacked judgment, but because I possess exactly the kind of resourcefulness, determination, and tactical thinking the military trained into me. Every day I stayed alive was a victory against odds designed to break me. That doesn't make me unreliable. That makes me a survivor." The jury responded to that. Wesley could see it in their faces, the shift from skepticism to consideration. When Lieutenant Foster's journal was entered into evidence, when the financial records were presented, when Agent Martinez testified about the pattern of targeting veterans from Operation Copper Canyon, the case against Briggs became overwhelming. The colonel's own arrogance helped. He took the stand in his own defense, confident and dismissive, treating the entire proceeding as beneath him. But under cross-examination, his carefully constructed facade cracked. He made mistakes, contradicted earlier statements, revealed the contempt he felt for the men he'd commanded. When the prosecutor asked why he'd ordered a retreat that would have left wounded men behind, Briggs had answered with brutal honesty. "I made a tactical decision to preserve the majority of the force. Sacrificing 3 wounded men to save 20 others is basic mathematics." The courtroom had gone silent. The prosecutor had pressed. "So, Lieutenant Foster was wrong to disobey your order?" Briggs had smiled coldly. Lieutenant Foster was naive. He thought every life was equally valuable. Combat teaches different lessons. That answer, more than any evidence, sealed Briggs's fate. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Wesley had been standing outside the courthouse when the verdict came down, unable to sit in the courtroom for deliberations, too nervous to be still. Lillian had waited with him, and Sargent, and Father Miguel, and a dozen veterans from Operation Copper Canyon who'd traveled to be there. When the word came guilty, they'd wept together, a collective release of 25 years of injustice finally acknowledged. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Owen Briggs received 15 years for the weapons trafficking and corruption charges, plus additional time for the attempted kidnapping and witness intimidation. At 68 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. As the judge pronounced the terms, Wesley felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a quiet settling, like a book closing on a chapter that had remained open too long. Justice wasn't victory. It was simply the world acknowledging what had always been true. Lieutenant Marcus Foster had been murdered by his commanding officer's cowardice and corruption. The men he'd saved had been targeted for silencing. Lillian had been threatened for seeking truth. And Wesley's 3 years of homelessness had been engineered by a man who feared exposure. All of it was now recorded, acknowledged, punished. It didn't undo the harm, didn't restore the years, but it mattered. After the sentencing, Lillian organized one final gathering at the Hudson Valley House. All the veterans came, bringing families, bringing stories, bringing the beginning of healing. They planted trees in Lieutenant Foster's memory, 12 saplings that would grow and endure, long after all of them were gone. Wesley stood with Sargent and watched the families laugh and play, children running through grass, old soldiers swapping stories that grew more embellished with each telling. This was what Marcus Foster had died for, Wesley realized. Not for victory in a single battle, but for this continuity, family, the future extending beyond any individual sacrifice. Father Miguel approached, carrying 2 cups of lemonade and wearing a smile that reached his eyes. "You look peaceful, my friend." Wesley accepted the lemonade. "I feel peaceful, Father, for the first time in years." Father Miguel nodded. "You've earned it. You stood in the gap when no one else would. You protected the vulnerable when you were vulnerable yourself. That's the truest form of courage. Wesley thought about that. I just did what needed doing. What Lieutenant Foster taught me to do. Father Miguel shook his head gently. Wesley, Lieutenant Foster saved your life. But you saved your own soul. You could have become bitter, could have let homelessness destroy your compassion, could have walked away when Lillian needed help because helping her endangered you. Instead, you chose loyalty over safety, justice over convenience, honor over survival. That wasn't Lieutenant Foster's teaching. That was you, choosing to be the man you've always been, despite everything trying to convince you otherwise. The words landed with the weight of absolution. Wesley had been carrying guilt for 3 years. Guilt for ending up homeless. Guilt for needing help. Guilt for not being the soldier he'd once been. But maybe Father Miguel was right. Maybe the soldier he'd been and the man he'd become weren't different people. Maybe they were the same person, tested in different ways, proving the same core truths through different circumstances. Loyalty knows no color, courage knows no circumstance, and family is built by those who stand together when it matters most. Lillian joined them, Sergeant at her heels as always. I have something for you, she said to Wesley. She handed him an envelope, heavy with something more than paper. Wesley opened it and found a set of keys, a deed, and a letter. The letter was in Lillian's handwriting. Wesley, the carriage house is yours. Legally, permanently, irrevocably yours. No rent, no obligations, no strings. It's a home, not a favor. It's family, not charity. It's what my father would have wanted, and what I want, and what you've more than earned. You're not a guest anymore. You're home. Wesley couldn't speak, couldn't process. Home. The word felt foreign after 3 years without one, but it also felt right, inevitable, like something that had been waiting for him all along. Lillian continued, I'm also making you Director of Veteran Services for the Foster Foundation. Salary, benefits, authority to build programs that actually help people instead of just processing paperwork. You know what veterans need because you've lived it. I want you to make sure no one else goes through what you went through. Will you do that? Wesley looked at Sergeant, who looked back with calm approval. He looked at Father Miguel, who nodded encouragingly. He looked at Lillian, who was offering not just employment but purpose, not just a house but a home, not just gratitude but family. Yes, Wesley said, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, I'll do that. Thank you. For everything. For seeing me. For trusting me. For reminding me who I am. Lillian smiled and hugged him, and Father Miguel joined the embrace, and Sergeant pressed against all of them, completing the circle. Around them, veterans and families celebrated under summer sky. Children played in grass watered by Lieutenant Foster's sacrifice, and the future Marcus Foster had died to protect unfolded in laughter and connection and joy. The sun was setting over the Hudson Valley, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Wesley stood with his family chosen rather than blood, but no less real, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he belonged. If this story touched your heart, please share your own experiences with loyalty, courage, or the power of second chances in the comments below. Your story matters, and someone out there needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story about veterans, their faithful companions, and the incredible bonds that transcend all barriers. These are real stories about real heroes, and they deserve to be heard. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another inspiring story of loyalty and courage that will restore your faith in humanity. Drop a comment 12 for the 12 soldiers Lieutenant Foster saved, and for the bond that brought Wesley and Lillian together across generations, proving that heroism echoes through time. Thank you to all veterans and their families for your service and sacrifice. Thank you for listening, and thank you for caring. These stories matter because you make them matter.